January 23rd, 1997.
Everyone knows this Budweiser from the world's largest brewer. It is one of the world's most valuable trademarks. But there are other horses in the world, and there is another Budweiser from one of the world's smallest brewers.
To my mind, the beer made by Budweiser Budvar is one of the world's truly great beers.
And when little Czech Bud had a chance to make a lot of money by selling out to big American Bud, it seemed like a sure thing.
We cannot sell it to the United States.
The Americans found out there was something a lot more important than money.
It has the name of the town. The town has the name of the beer. The beer is the town.
Tonight, when you say Bud, dollars versus pride.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
They must be effective, or Anheuser-Busch wouldn't be spending $1.3 million to put each 30-second spot on the air during Sunday's Super Bowl. But here's one person who thinks those commercials with animated bottles of Bud and Bud Light competing in the Bud Bowl are sort of pointless, especially when you come to realize that Budweiser has for years been engaged in a genuine battle with what some people, and I realize I'm treading on really dangerous ground here, what some people would consider a real beer. You have to understand that there is a significant portion of the world's beer-drinking population that considers most American beers to be just a pale imitation of the real thing. Granted, that's just a matter of taste, but matters of taste have been known to lead to some really nasty disagreements. And when you add things like tradition and brand name and distribution rights and, of course, national pride, well, we all know what can happen when national pride enters the picture. So what does all of that have to do with Budweiser? Well, I guess I should have explained Budweiser is much more than just a beer. A Budweiser is a person or thing that comes from a place in the heart of Europe which the Germans called Budweis and the Czechs called České Budějovice. Let me have Edward Serrata tell you the whole story.
In 1989, communism fell in Central Europe. And soon after, the Czech and Slovak republics went their separate ways. Now, a few years later, the Czech Republic, made up of Bohemia and Moravia, is the economic star of the former East Bloc. The entire country seems to be embracing all things American. Even here in České Budějovice, a beautiful town in South Bohemia, you can have lunch at McDonald's. You can buy an Apple computer, or pick up the newest Sheryl Crow disc. You can learn English in one of several schools. And after a hard day of learning your new language, you can relax with a Budweiser. Not this Budweiser. This Budweiser. Look, I know it's late. It's nearly midnight, but you're not seeing double. And tonight's Nightline is the story of the two Budweiser beers and how they got that way. It's also the story of how Anheuser-Busch, the world's largest brewery, tried to buy into a brewery that makes as much beer in a year as Anheuser-Busch does in a week, and failed. Now, to get some background on this story, let's turn to England's Michael Jackson, a man known the world over as the beer hunter.
Some of the most significant early mentions of brewing anywhere in Europe are mentions of beer being made in Bohemia. Mr. Adolphus Busch I took a trip to Europe, and undoubtedly while he was in Europe, he was very aware of the success of the beers from the city of Budweis, which would have just been known as Budweiser beers, just in the way that wine made in the Champagne region is known as champagne wine, or wine made in Oporto is known as port wine. And he came back to the United States and decided to launch a beer called Budweiser.
Adolphus Busch registered the name Budweiser as a trademark in the 1870s, but the Czechs didn't actually name one of their beers Budweiser until 20 years later.
The argument that the people in the town of Budweis and the breweries in Budweis would have as to their use of the name Budweiser is, hey, it's our town, the breweries are here, anything that comes from Budweis is a Budweiser beer. The argument that Anheuser-Busch have is, yes, that's all very well, but the brewery in Budweis wasn't established until 1895, and by that time Anheuser-Busch had already registered in the US, of course. So both sides do have quite a good case. It does require a certain judgment of Solomon.
Well, Solomon ain't around. And contracts signed by Anheuser-Busch and Budweiser Budvar back in 1939 mean you can't buy a Czech Bud in the US and other markets, and you can't buy Anheuser-Busch Bud in Germany, Austria, and elsewhere. But in 1989, while communism was falling in Central Europe, beer sales in America were starting to go flat. Anheuser-Busch, looking to expand globally, decided to try to buy into Budweiser Budvar, and not coincidentally, put an end to the old trademark dispute. They even put on their very best corporate manners by opening the St. Louis Center in České Budějovice, in effect, a public relations move.
The St. Louis Center is a very good thing for me because I can borrow books so I can read and, you know, get my English better.
I'm a computer fan, so that's great that people have possibility to try to work on the computers. There's also internet, which is great. There you have contact with the whole world.
So while Anheuser-Busch was showing the good people of České Budějovice it could be a good corporate neighbor, its negotiators were offering to take Budweiser Budvar into the 21st century with marketing savvy, advertising pizzazz, and American know-how. So you wonder, who in behind the times pollution-coated, coal-burning, under-capacity Central Europe was going to say no to that? You'd be surprised. After all, the Czechs here had something they hadn't had in a long, long time: freedom.
What the Americans did not take into account was that in a country that had been occupied again and again, there was something more important than money: independence. That when we come back.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Nissan.
After the Czechs got their hard-won freedom in 1989, they wanted to enjoy it for all it was worth. This was something they wanted to savor. Make no mistake, the folks at Budweiser Budvar wanted to hear what Anheuser-Busch had to say. But they were reluctant, maybe even fearful. And to understand why, let's go back a few years. The past 100 years have been pretty rough on Central Europe, and this brewery went into production in 1895, during the Austrian occupation. Less than 20 years later, it was hit by World War I. Just getting over that was something to celebrate. I mean, for the very first time, there was a Czechoslovak state. But in 1938 and 1939, the Germans occupied the country. And after World War II, the German invaders were replaced by Russian invaders. Now, Czechs like to say that communism is a great experiment, only it should never be tried on people. And while the country's industry was nationalized, the first communist president, Klement Gottwald, had a special regard for his country's beer. He was so patriotic, rumor has it that he drank himself to death. And for the next 40 years, weird-looking ads notwithstanding, Budweiser Budvar kept producing great beer. Then came 1989 and Svobodu, freedom. And suddenly, Brewmasters at Budweiser Budvar like Jerzy Bocek and Josef Tolar gave the commies the boot, brought in this economist, Peter Jansky, and together they restructured their brewery.
Before 1989, all the companies had to give up all their profits to the state, and then funding for investment, general overhaul and wages was also decided by the state. So the brewery at that time just had no authority to use our own profit. Now our country has a Western-style economy and our brewery is run on a Western-style basis.
Anheuser-Busch pursued two tracks in the Czech Republic: to purchase a percentage of the brewery and to negotiate the trademark issue, meaning that bothersome name the Czechs were using, Budweiser.
Anheuser-Busch repeatedly pushed our brewery to give up the geographical use of the name all over the world, except in a small part of Central Europe. So the negotiations were always about one thing: control of the name Budweiser.
Control of this brewery was not something the Czechs were going to give up. And in many former communist countries, a strain of anti-Americanism overshadowed many such negotiations. But not here.
I like American blues, jazz. Jimi Hendrix is my favorite.
And some groups now, like Red Hot Chili Peppers and Metallica.
I especially like Harley Davidson, motorbikes.
What I'm quite curious about, how does it work that so much different people can live together in one state, so much different states that it works. That's what I adore about America. That's what I like.
Adore about America? That's different. And these kids are damn proud of what Czechs do well. Like movies, for instance.
I don't find the films quite as good as the Czech ones. I think the Americans and the films are a bit superficial. So the films are like more set to the very expensive tricks. But the core is not that good. In the Czech films we use often the tradition. We show the classical Czech person, our feelings.
And if you think Czechs are proud of their films, just ask the people of České Budějovice about letting some outsider even get close to Budweiser Budvar beer.
It has the name of a town. The town has the name of the beer. The beer is the town.
It's a part of a Czech tradition, and it's a part of our nation.
It would be pity if Anheuser-Busch bought this Budweiser, because we go to pubs with my friends and we drink beer a lot. And one.
Aren't you a little young to be drinking beer?
Well.
And when Miroslav Beneš, mayor of České Budějovice, hears that Anheuser-Busch has a long 100-year tradition of making beer in St. Louis, he says,
From our point of view, it's nothing. 100 years, it's one century. We are here more than 7 centuries.
7 centuries? Well, that's long enough to develop an evolutionary species of brewers, isn't it?
I sometimes think these people have an almost inherited memory of how to make beer. You know, it's as though it's sort of right there to their fingertips.
But regrettably, not in your fingertips, because this beer just isn't sold in the USA. And when we come back, we'll look into why Budweiser Budvar has an almost mystical following. To get to the heart of this Bud versus Bud story, let's look at the people here. We start with this. The Czechs are different than you and me. You see, time just seems to move slower here.
You live a lot faster than we do. We live more peacefully. And if the Americans come, and if they are here just to do some business, they want everything fast.
In some ways, we're similar. I mean, Czechs don't like journalists very much. But they do warm their hot dog buns on little pointy spikes. Their kids stand up when teachers walk in the room. And they drink almost twice as much beer a year as we do. There's one very good reason for that.
To my mind, the beer made by Budweiser Budvar is one of the world's truly great beers. It just has a wonderful, creamy malt character and a very, very delicate, almost perfumey, flowery hop aroma. And you raise the glass, this wonderful, rich-looking glass of beer, you raise it to your lips. Then you drink the beer and it slips down almost too easily, and the sweet flavors of the malt are truly delicious flavors.
And sadly, you can't taste it. But you can learn the secrets of why this is such a great beer. We start here. This is the brew house of Budweiser Budvar, and here's where the process begins and the artistry starts. You see these 3 copper kettles? Well, this is where the pure artesian spring water meets the finest malting barleys in the world, and they are boiled, not once like in many breweries, but 3 different times. This is all part of the process that coaxes natural sugars from the malt. After this process is complete, the next step is to add the hops. Now, the finest and most expensive hops in the whole world just happen to be grown 100 miles north of here in Žatec, in northern Bohemia. And these hops are added to the liquid. Well, how much exactly? How do they know when they've added just the right amount? With computers or measuring devices? No. They taste it. The next step happens here, and the liquid is pumped into these tanks, injected with yeast, and the fermentation process begins. Finally, the beer is channeled out of these tanks here into the cellar. This is where the last stage of the fermentation process begins. Now, it's cold in here. It's almost freezing. But this is where a CO2, or carbon dioxide, is naturally produced. That's what gives us that rich, foamy head. Now, this process lasts in America about 2 to 3 weeks in most breweries, but here, things move slower in Central Europe, so they let it stay for 2 months. After that, they put around 5% of their output in cans. Czechs think that cans are something you take on a picnic, but not much more. Around 45% goes into glass bottles, and around half goes into kegs like these, which are consumed in places like this, the Masny Kramy, a fine beer hall in the middle of Český Budějovice. This is where friends gather to meet and have dinner, enjoy a beer or two, and talk long into the Bohemian night.
There are some advertising campaigns in America that talk about beers having great taste and no aftertaste. That's such a meretricious claim, because beer should have an aftertaste. You know, you want to know that you actually did have a beer. You didn't just have a glass of water, you had a beer. And when you drink a Budweiser Budvar, you certainly know you just had a beer, but it is a devilishly beguiling beer, and you finish up wanting another one. Especially if you're sitting in a tavern in the Czech Republic, where there's talk and debate about soccer and ice hockey and politics and philosophy and the meaning of life. And I'll have another beer, please, by the way, as well. In fact, you don't really need to ask for another beer, because when you reach the end of your glass, or sometime before you reach the end of your glass, an eagle-eyed waiter is already on the way with another one. So it's an experience that you really have to be a little careful that you don't get too lost in the meaning of life. But it's a very nice way of getting lost in the meaning of life.
Well, Anheuser-Busch didn't get lost in the meaning of life, and they walked away from the negotiations. It wasn't the Czechs who did it. A couple of years back, Anheuser-Busch stopped trying to buy into the brewery here, and in September 1996, they gave up on the trademark issue. But at Anheuser-Busch, I bet you there's someone who's still sitting there wondering, I wonder where we went wrong. I wonder why the Czechs never took us up on all our offers. Well, I think I know why. You see, The people here have been making a great beer for 700 years. I mean, through 400 years of the Austrians, I mean, through the Nazis, even the communists. Now that they've got the chance to stand on their own, I don't think they want to take lessons from anyone. Or as they say in Czech, Toto bud, meni vaše. That means, this bud's not for you. This is Edward Serrata for ABC Nightline in České Budějovice.